بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وبعد. Welcome to a new series in which we are going to be studying Fiqh of Islam according to the Hanafi madhab بإذن using the book ul-Murīdīn في إقامة فرائض الدين by the famous scholar Sheikh Abdul Ghani al-Ghunaymi al-Maydani rahimahullah ta'ala. Prior to looking at the author and the text, we are going to take a brief introduction to fiqh, and we are going to look at some questions that are important for us to have a brief understanding within prior to actually studying the rulings, etc. So the first question, what is fiqh? Fiqh, linguistically, it is comprehension, to understand. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, مَن يُرِدِ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا يُفَقِّهُ فِي الدِّينِ. Whomever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants good for, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him comprehension, understanding in the deen. This is a general understanding of Islam holistically in all areas and aspects of Islam. Technically, i.e. according to the scholars of fiqh, the scholars of Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh means to have an understanding of the masail, the issues of application, such as tahara, salah, zakah, hajj, and so on and so forth, according to the evidences taken from the, in summary, in brief, Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So fiqh is basically to understand how to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all areas of our lives. And this leads to another question, why should we study fiqh? And is it compulsory for us to study fiqh? So firstly, we should study fiqh, of course, so that we know how to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as Islam is in brief again, a marriage between the outward application of Islam and the inward application of Islam, of Iman, of purification, etc. As detailed in the hadith of Jibreel alayhi salam, wherein he visited the Prophet alayhi salam, and the Prophet alayhi salam was asked by Jibreel about Islam, and the Prophet ﷺ mentioned the five ahkam, the five pillars, of Islam. And then Jibreel ﷺ, he asked him about Iman, and the Prophet ﷺ mentioned the 6 pillars of Iman. And then Jibreel ﷺ asked him about Ihsan, and the Prophet ﷺ, he replied with, أَن تَعْبُدَ اللَّهَ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَرَاهُ فَإِنَّهُ يَرَاكَ. To worship Allah as if you see Him, and if you do not see Him, you know that He subhanahu wa ta'ala sees you, i.e. the inward application of Islam, which is tazkiyah and akhlaq, and as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, ihsan. So these are the 3 areas that a person needs to focus upon when trying to learn about Islam and apply Islam in their life. So this part that we are focusing on now would be considered Islam, the part of Islam, i.e. the pillars, the application, the ahkam, the rulings. And that would include the ibadat, the acts of worship, and nikah, mu'amalat, jinayat, etc. Although we're not going to go into the latter sections in this series, we're only going to focus on the ibadat, as this is a basic text, an introductory text to fiqh, to Islamic jurisprudence. But in the area of Islam, in the area of practical application of Islam, a person would try to acquire understanding of all areas of Islam, and that would be basically anything which is relevant to his or her everyday life. So for all of us, it's compulsory to understand how to pray, how to purify, how to pay zakah, how to perform hajj, how to fast, as these are acts of worship which are compulsory upon all of us as individuals. And a person may find that it is compulsory upon them to study the ahkam which pertain to medicine, which pertain to trade, transaction. For example, if a person is going to get married, they would have to have an understanding of that which relates to marriage, to divorce, and so on and so forth. And depending on a person's career, as we said, medicine, trade, transaction, etc., a person would have to understand the rulings which relate to their career path. So it's important for us to have an understanding of Islam in all areas of our lives, and that would differ from person to person outside of the ibadat. As for the ibadat, the acts of worship, the 5 pillars, including the shahadatain, this is compulsory upon all of us to have an understanding within. And that brings us to our next question, which is, how should we study fiqh? how should we study fiqh and why we should study a madhab. So how we should study fiqh is, as I just indicated, to study a madhab, one of the 4 schools of fiqh according to the scholars of Islam, which we should be following: the Hanafi madhab, the Maliki madhab, the Shafi'i madhab, or the Hanbali madhab. And if a person does not have access to someone who can teach these madhabs, then at least follow someone who is well learned in one of these 4 madhabs. And this is the way of our scholarship, the way of our ummah for the past 1,200 or so years. Ibn Hubayra rahimahullah ta'ala, the great Hanbali scholar and Imam of Hadith in his time, he mentioned a consensus that it is permissible and recommended for a person to follow one of the 4 madhabs. Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali rahimahullah, he extensively details the importance of studying one of the 4 schools of fiqh and following one of the 4 schools of fiqh. Why? Because it provides a framework for us, a remit with which protects us from following our desires, following new and invented ideas, new and invented ideologies, new and invented opinions due to the perceptions or the philosophies or the misunderstandings of the day. Following a classical school of fiqh provides us with that protection, that framework. It makes it easy for us to focus on connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instead of focusing on the details of how to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so studying a madhab, it's very important in our time. It gives us that framework, it gives us that security. And this leads us to the next point, the inception of the Hanafi madhab, the inception of madhabs generally. It's sometimes said that this is the madhab of Imam so-and-so, which it's true, but at the same time, what is really being said, it's the madhab formulated by this particular individual, and his formulation is basically a formulation of that which came before him. So as an example, Imam Abu Hanifa, one of the teachers of Imam Abu Hanifa, Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman rahimahullah ta'ala, and Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, he took from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i rahimahullah, who took from Alqama, who was from the Tabi'een, who took from Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala, the great companion of the Prophet alayhi salam, who of course took from the Prophet alayhi salam himself. And so you see that when you follow the Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, you are following the opinions of the Tabi'een and the companions that came before him, which of course came from the Prophet alayhi salam. So you're following a chain of understanding. You're not simply following Quran and Sunnah without understanding the companions' opinions and approach and practices. You're following the companions' approach and the companions' practices and the companions' understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah. And in that which there were no opinions to be taken from the companions and the tabi'een in areas of fiqh, the scholars of the madhab and the scholars of the other madhabs likewise, they would derive the rulings and the fatawa, and they would come up with solutions to problems based upon the principles derived from the approaches of the companions and the tabi'een. So when you follow a madhab, you are following the approach of the earlier generations of Islam, taken of course from the Prophet ﷺ. And so a question may arise, why is it then that the madhabs differ? Why is there a difference of opinion? And there are various reasons for this. One of the main reasons, because of the spread of the companions. Different companions spread out in different places, which led to different fatawas, different approaches being taken. And they all stem from the Prophet ﷺ. So as an example, in Medina, you had the madhab formulated by Imam Malik, and that would have been in line with the companions, the tabi'een that lived in the Hijazi region. The Hanafi madhab was in line with the opinions, the fatawa, the principles of the companions and the tabi'een in the Iraqi region. And likewise, Imam al-Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad, a similar story can be said. Although their approaches, you could say perhaps, was a slight marriage between the approach of Medina and Iraq. But the point being, when we follow a madhab, we are following an understanding given to us by the tabi'een and the companions. And so there is no need to reinvent the wheel. We should make it easy for ourselves and follow the madhahib in the issues which have been formulated, they have been arrived at according to the evidences of as understood by our great scholars, etc. In new matters which were not relevant previously, they didn't exist previously, we will follow the scholars of our time who base their rulings, their fatwa, upon the principles of the said madhahib, i.e. the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi'i and Ahmad rahimahumullah ta'ala jami'an. So how is it that a person would study a madhab if they've selected a madhab to study? And I would recommend that a person studies the predominant madhab of their people. So for example, a person who is of Southeast Asian heritage, study the Hanafi madhab. A person of East African heritage, study the Shafi'i madhab. A person of the North African heritage such as Mauritania and Algeria, etc., study the Maliki madhab. There are regions which you have more choice, for example, Egypt, Sham, etc. All of the madhahib were prevalent, although perhaps some more so than others. But choose the madhab of your people. Why? So that you can lessen the likelihood of differing with your people. There's no need for differences to be pushed further in our time. We need to come together in unity and unison with each other. But back to the point, so how is it that a person will study a madhab? They would select an introductory text, such as the text that we're going to go through now, is ul-Murīdīn, and they would study it with a person who has understanding of that text, understanding of the author's intentions, and they have studied it with someone else, etc. So a teacher who is well versed in what they are teaching, and then after they've completed that, study an intermediate text and go on and study something more advanced. So for example, someone might study in the Hanafi madhab is ul-Murīdīn, and they go on to Nur al-Idah, and then go on to al-Quduri, or one of the other four relied upon texts, or five in the Hanafi madhab, and once they've completed that, they can go on to a more advanced text. But the point is to take things slowly, and in the meanwhile, whilst the person is acquiring understanding of the madhab, acquiring understanding of fiqh, they should be applying it. They should be practicing according to what they are studying. And a time will come wherein they do have some leeway to consider other opinions, but that takes a long time. It's a process. And of course, that's an advanced level to reach, and it's not something which can be reached by everyone. But following a madhab, it is the way of our traditions, it is our heritage, and it is less likely to cause division, disunity, and problems within our communities. If we appreciate that there are four practiced madhabs, and they are mainstream, they are all relevant, they all go back to the Quran and the Sunnah, they are all valid, then we can live with each other, practice Islam with each other, and we do not need to differ with each other. And the same can be said in the issues of aqaid. There are three mainstream schools, the Ash'ari, the Maturidi and the Athari. The Ash'ari and Maturidi being practiced by the Hanafis and the Shafi'is and the Malikis, and the Athari being practiced by the Hanbali madhab. All three of them, they stem from the Quran and the Sunnah. Their differences are differences which are based upon differences of interpretation, principles that lead to different conclusions, etc. We should accept that these differences are present. They have been present within our ummah for hundreds of years now, and we have to accept the validity of these mainstream schools and work together in bringing up solutions for the problems of our time and traversing the path towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Hanafi madhab, it stems from Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, but Imam Abu Hanifa, the chain goes back to the Prophet ﷺ, having taken from Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, who took from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, who took from Alqamah, who took from Ibn Mas'ud, who took from the Prophet ﷺ, and likewise Imam Abu Hanifa also studied with Ata ibn Abi Rabah, especially in the ahkam of Hajj. You'll see that this is the case, who was from the great tabi'in of his time, who studied with the companions that went back to the Prophet ﷺ. There are some opinions of Ali ibn Abi Talib that are relied upon as well in the Hanafi madhab. So you see that the madhahib are basically a formulation of the opinions of the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, and solutions to problems which later arise based upon principles derived from the Sahaba and the Tabi'een's approach to the ahkam of their time. With that, we'll start with the text, inshallah. Is'afu ul-Murīdīn li'iqamati fara'id ad-din by Sheikh Abdul Ghani al-Ghunaymi al-Maydani, rahimahullah ta'ala, who was a 13th century scholar from Sham, and his most famous teacher, Ibn Abidin, his famous text, Al-Hashiyah, which is a relied upon commentary in the Hanafi madhab, a compendium of knowledge. So one of the most famous texts authored by Sheikh Abdul Ghani al-Ghunaymi rahimahullah, Al-Lubab fi Sharh al-Kitab, which is a commentary on Al-Quduri, Mukhtasar al-Quduri. Likewise, he also authored a commentary on Al-Aqidah al-Tahawiyah, explaining the Maturidi approach to the Sunni theology of Islam. And he has other texts that are well known. He is a famous scholar, a relied upon scholar in our time today. He passed away a few centuries ago. Rahimahullah ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this a blessed endeavor, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of people of understanding and the people of fiqh. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in.